Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Mr. Randy Rosin. Randy is a faculty member of the National Intelligence University in Bethesda, Maryland, who teaches courses in information power, strategic communications, propaganda, cyber threat intelligence, denial and deception, and leadership. Randy enlisted in the Army in 1979 and served in uniform for over 3 decades. While in the Army, he served worldwide in senior intelligence and information operations positions. Mr. Rosin is currently a Ph.D. candidate in the School of Communications at American University. Randy Rosin, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, John. Thank you for having me.
I'm hoping that you can give our audience a little bit more background on what sounds like a very long and successful Army career.
Yeah, sure. It was. I like to think of it as rich and varied. I was a combat arms. I was a combat arms guy who took some soirees into psychological operations, information operations, and Middle Eastern foreign area officer. So I had the privilege of being the IO chief in Iraq from 2009 to 2010 with the First Corps rotation in the box, and then immediately followed that up with I got a job offer to be the IO chief at CENTCOM from 10 to 12, and then I got the call back to being a Middle Eastern FAO to be the senior defense official and defense attaché for Yemen, which is what I did for 2 years. And I can say that was certainly that was an adventure.
This is in you said the 2012 timeframe?
Yeah, 2012 to 2014. I was the last DAT to go there and actually finish a tour. My successor, I think it was about 6 months, they closed the embassy, so he had to shut everything down and evacuate all of our equipment and whatnot from Yemen.
DAT, for our audience that may not be familiar, is the defense attaché, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, yeah. And since retiring from the Army, you have been pursuing a Ph.D. And could you tell us a little bit more about your studies?
Sure. Yeah, serendipitously, I was offered a position, teaching position at the National Intelligence University in the cyber threat intelligence concentration. And at that point in time, I was like, well, why not, why not pursue a PhD? So just down the street from NIU is American University, and they offered a PhD in communications, which, as I studied it, actually fit in quite well with my experience and background as a PsyOper and IO guy. So I embarked on that journey in 2017, and I'm an ABD, all but dissertation, and working on the finishing touches right now.
Uh-huh. Nice. I'm just curious. Sidebar: is the GI Bill helping at all with your studies?
It is totally paying the whole thing.
Nice.
Yeah, and AU is great. They have a yellow ribbon program there. Yeah, it's worked out better than expected.
All right, yeah. For all you military folks listening, getting ready to get out or retire, here's a success story on deploying the GI Bill. benefit that comes with military service. So, so what is your dissertation on?
Well, I'm looking at it. The great thing about the program at American University is that they look at the confluence between information and communication technology and democracy and communication. So, so in that vein, my dissertation is working at the confluence of information and communication technology and propaganda. And I'm using a Russian case study to highlight how the Russians have adapted information communication technology with their influence techniques.
Could you tell us a little bit more about, or maybe contrast the Russian methodologies compared to the West or the U.S. in particular?
Yeah, sure. One of the big takeaways, that my case study will demonstrate is that the Russians have really adapted to new information and communication technology in terms of information doctrine much better than we have in the U.S. and in the West. And the interesting thing is through my research, the Russians were paying attention to our doctrinal development. Like I've looked at 30 years, going back to 1990 to the present day, of their theoretical literature, regarding information operations and whatnot. And they, in the 90s, they were actually blown away by Desert Storm. I mean, that really knocked them back for a loop. They couldn't believe they saw it as a total information war, because what we did was initially we blinded the Iraqis as to what we were doing, and then we influenced their how they processed what we were doing through psychological operations and jamming, electronic warfare. So they were still thinking at the 90s, they were still thinking like Soviet Army kind of tactics. So when they saw what we did in Desert Storm, for 2 or 3 years after Desert Storm, through 92 to 95, a lot of their literature was talking about that. So it made a big impact. And oh, by the way, the Chinese in their literature as well also noted the lessons from Desert Storm. And we produced a lot of theoretical literature on the nature of information warfare and so on and so forth. And one of the seminal ideas that developed out of the 90s for us was this concept of network-centric warfare. And almost all of our capabilities are derived from achieving that network-centric warfare effect. However, we were all in on developing technical capabilities of network-centric warfare concepts. Whereas the Russians were like, all right, we're pretty much broke. We don't have a lot of money. So we can't invest in this like the US and the West can. And so they focused more on developing their doctrine and theory, which to a large extent reflects cybernetic thinking. And going back a few years, I don't know if there's any Sovietologists out there, but you had the dialectical materialism was the official science of the Soviet Union until the 1960s, when cybernetics replaced dialectical materialism as the official science of the Soviet Union. So a lot of
it would be helpful, I think, if you could take just a moment to define what those terms mean, or give just a little bit of background as far as what cybernetics means and dialectic determinism.
Yeah, cybernetics was a concept that was developed by Norbert Wiener in the late 1940s, and has largely been accredited with one of the fundamental and foundational theories that form the information age. So Wiener defined it as the science concerned with the study of systems of any nature that are capable of receiving, storing, and processing information so as to use it for, and this is important, for control. So in his mind, he was thinking that, and he says this, he specifies is that communication and control in the animal and the machine are essentially the same thing. And the way that it works is in feedback loops, and it's the system has to be a purpose. There has to be a purpose to a system. So, for example, one of the famous examples is the thermostat. So you set this thermostat at 70 degrees, and if the temperature goes above or below, a sensor picks up the change, sends a signal to the control element. The control element processes the machine that will, either raise or increase the temperature to get at the 70 degrees for which it is set, and starts the machine, and machine starts, the temperature gets to the desired temperature, and that's how the system works. That's the same way biologically our systems work. So the notion of homeostasis and how biologically our body does the same thing, where, we have to maintain a certain internal temperature, and our body measures the environment and adapts our bodies to the environment. And so that's also evolution, the ability to collect information from the environment, process it, and adapt to, in direct relation to the information that you are receiving from your environment, is the essence of a cybernetic system.
Right. So, and then also not only process the information and adapt, but also exhaust information back into the environment, which then gets processed into the uptake of adjacent systems as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the outgrowths of cybernetics is systems theory, which is, I think, what you're, what you just described. Right. So the Russians really adapted cybernetics to their theory. So when you have in their doctrine, you have information technical and you have information psychological, and those are two sides of the same coin for them. And so from that idea, you have organizations and operating principles that are developed with the technical and psychological in mind. So, for example, the GRU have their example are the KVI, what they call them, the KVI troops or organization. And so in one side, one section of the organization, they have the fancy bear organization that's hacking around the world, the doping, the 2016 election, those are the most effective hackers that the Russians have, but they're not operating in their own isolated cyber command, because right next to them in the next section, you have what they call political technicians, or their psyopers. So, they're psyopers from the get-go, and their technicians are working hand in hand. And so what this allows is them to conceive of operations such as a hack and release. And whereas with us, in contrast, you have cyber command, which is, I know I'm saying this wrong, but subunified command or combatant command. I lose track of how we think of Cyber
Yeah.
Command. Now,
Uh-huh.
so you have them as a standalone organization, and then you have our PsyOpers buried down in RSOF somewhere. So I'm aware on, like, I think they have there's one PsyOp major who's actually a permanent staff member on Cyber Command. But and I'm aware that there's a group of PsyOpers working with Cyber Command on a project. But it's unclear. When I talked to them last, they were saying like, well, they don't really know how to use us, and but
some integration piece is missing, which is baked into the cake for the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, we've reached the end of where we can go with Cyber Command without rethinking the whole thing and embedding people who are, psychological operations specialists within their organization. And let me give you an example of, how, what I mean by, like, where's my evidence for saying, well, we've reached the logical end of what we can do with Cyber Command without engaging the cognitive component to it.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2018, it was open source that Cyber Command, brought down the IRA, operation. But they pulled the trigger on the actual election day. Okay, which they've achieved their effects already by election day. If you really understand, if you're planning to do this right, you know that the effects that you achieve in terms of influencing an election, let's say, you want to hit your peak a week before the election. I mean, I did this in Iraq, with our election support planning. We reached the peak, the top of our sine wave, a week before the election in terms of volume and intensity, because research has showed us, and there are communication theories which also back this up, such as priming and agenda setting, and that people don't make up their, the people you want to influence for election don't start paying attention to the election until about 5 to 7 days.
Okay.
And then there's only a certain amount of time where people, where people are thinking about it or pay attention to it. So, and this is what Kathleen Jamieson, in her Cyber War, in her book called Cyber War, she does a brilliant job in disabusing ourselves of the notion that it's unknowable, the impact that the Russians had on. And she's like, no, wait a minute, it is knowable. We have these theories that are well grounded, that are proved over time. And when the Russians released their latest WikiLeaks, like I think it was the Thursday, the week before the election, and Comey on Friday reopens the election, reopens the investigation on Clinton.
Yeah, that was a big moment.
Yeah, well, so all the news shows were talking about that over the weekend in the early part of the week. So what people were primed to evaluate, this is priming theory, how people were primed to think of Clinton prior, just going into the election was, she's untrustworthy, she lies, she's a, all these things. So, and so, Kathleen Jamieson demonstrates that, Clinton had, was well ahead by the last week. And then all of a sudden, this Comey thing hits for the next, 4 or 5 days, and people are going to the polls with this Comey investigation. She's able to say her support precipitously dropped, decreased. So it's a great book, and I would recommend that to anybody interested in this. But it goes to show you how smart the Russians were versus us in terms of getting WikiLeaks to release that the week before the election. So that's not an accident. And this is what they're capable of. That's a direct contrast right there about how they're able to conceive of these type of operations in the information environment versus us, where we pull the trigger like the day of the election, which is, so, I'd like to think that if, if we had some smart PSYOP guys at Cyber Command that, were at General Nakasoni's ear and said, "Hey, boss, we need to pull the trigger about a week before here." And that's how we.
And so this example that you were just painting for us, you can trace that right back to the Russian information operations tending to be more grounded in theory. Their information operations are applied theory, whereas our information operations don't tend to have that same grounding. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, definitely. Number one, just culturally speaking, we're not too great with theory and doctrine and all that. And, we used to frustrate our adversaries. I think there's some famous like German generals from World War II who would sort of laughingly, criticize you or make fun of the U.S. military by saying like war is chaos. And the reason why that Americans are good at war is because they practice chaos on a, on a daily basis. But other militaries other countries really stick to theory and doctrine, and the Russians are one of them.
Yeah, I want to go back to something you said probably 10 minutes ago now, but a common theme that I'm picking up on, that's relevant to the information problem in general is it's relatively inexpensive to be effective. And you mentioned, back in the early 90s, for example, maybe late 80s as well. When you're talking about Desert Storm, the Russians were marveled at the success, but they were at a point in their history where they were not flush with cash, and yet they were able to double down relatively inexpensively on theory. And here we are, 30 years later or so, where the Russians are formidable in the information space compared to us, and we've taken a more tech route. And it's like cheap, inexpensive theory and scalable information is besting technological advantage. Would you say that there's something to all that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it could be an accident of culture that goes to explaining why things are the way they are. Again, coming back to the notion that the Russians are more inclined to be theoretical, and in going through their literature, I could, it was like, I mean, it was, there was almost like a spiritual component to a lot what they were saying. Like there wasn't a lot of empirical evidence that was, produced. And I mean, they very much were engaged with ideas and not a lot of empirical, because I'm reading their stuff and and it was a lot. It was a lot of it, and my thought was like, well, okay, so how are you going to? Where's the proof? Where's the empirical evidence that supports these claims and assertions that you're making here? And but it just seems to be in where they've headed, and I have to think that this is the cybernetic influence because, if you think that you can control humans and animals in the same way, then that makes it easier for you to think of how you can combine the technical and the cognitive. And oh, by the way, their reflexive control theory, which animates their influence doctrine, is an outgrowth of second order cybernetics. So we second order cybernetics in the U.S. went off in like some epistemological forest. It went off into epistemology, whereas the Russians actually thought, hey, how can we operationalize this theory?
Yeah, they were looking to apply it in the real world.
Yeah, as applications, as opposed to like the epistemological kind of research positions that one might take. So yeah, so I mean,
can I linger on that for just a second? What is the value of taking the epistemological route? I mean, what are researchers or the U.S. getting from that, if not, applying cybernetics in the real world?
Yeah, it's epistemology as applied to research. So, for example, and this is particularly the case in social science research, where if you're conducting an ethnography or something of that nature, or phenomenological investigation.
Okay, yeah. I think I messed up epistemological a minute ago too. Okay.
Sweet. Okay, so we're in the same foxhole.
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, no, it as the investigator, you have to identify what your position is versus vis-a-vis the object that's under investigation. So because you in social science, in qualitative research, you are the instrument of measurement. So like in quantitative, like you might have a machine that measures, a Geiger counter that measures. So you're using, some other instrument to to generate your observations, to create your data. Whereas in a qualitative research methodology, you are the instrument that is creating the data that you will analyze, right? So what you have to do, and you need to include a section in your research report, is you have to identify the biases, self-identify the biases that you bring to that investigation in your background, and then talk about how you could mitigate the influence on what you're observing. So that's second order cybernetics. It's the observer to the observed, the investigator to the object, and where you're standing outside the system that's under observation. So that's how it ends up in epistemology. How we generate knowledge, and yeah. So
I see. So the U.S. is still advancing cybernetics and second order cybernetics, but it's confined to the realm of research rather than applying it into real world use case or utility.
Yeah, I mean, cybernetics in the U.S. is kind of it's been subsumed. The IEEE, for example, is the home of cybernetics of observed systems, which are technical systems. And our colleague, Dr. Umpleby, was the head of the I forget the other organization that was sort of shepherding, sort of the owner of second order cybernetics in the U.S. But you won't. It's dissipated across so many. Cybernetic thinking has dissipated across so many different disciplines that it almost doesn't really exist anymore. And part of the reason is because it, by its nature, is interdisciplinary. The start of cybernetics was were the Macy conferences, which brought an amazing range of backgrounds to the conference and trying to figure this out. And that's why it's so amazingly brilliant, because you had the the Margaret Meads, of the day, and Batesons and von Neumanns and Wieners and Shannons, and the who's who of big great thinkers of the day came together and pulled this concept together. And so it was interdisciplinary from the start, but that was also part of the reason why it kind of died, because our system, our academic system, doesn't lend itself to interdisciplinary, disciplines, so to speak, or areas, fields of study, because we all go to our little tribes, and we receive accolades and move up the pecking order in our own little tribes. And if you step out of the tribe to work interdisciplinary, you kind of get punished for that. So and I know Dr. Umpleby likes to say that the reason why cybernetics kind of petered out in the U.S. was because of defense funding, and it went towards the more technical aspects of cybernetics as opposed to the kind of cognitive and psychological.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, it's hard to, put some kind of a judgment on top of all this. It is what it is, and it evolved the way it evolved. But, I mean, would you say that, the way the information problem has surfaced over the last 5 to 10 years, the Russian emphasis on cybernetics as opposed to the diffusion of cybernetics in the U.S. is playing favorably for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the proof is in the pudding, as we as we see it on a daily basis. That Russia really gets it, and they're effectively employing the theory, and so and I think that we're struggling. We're struggling at it. There are some bright spots that I see. I think our cyber, I think they're heading down the right pathway, but I do. I am concerned about like some of the documents out there that I've reviewed. The joint concept of operations in the information environment. I look at that, and I'm like, well, it's we still don't get it. And one of the things that comes to mind is like there was a critique in there in JP 3-13, and the one that came out like in August 2014. I think it's still good to go, but that's
the Joint Chiefs of Staff Information Operations Doctrine. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So
we'll put a link to that into the show notes.
Okay, good deal. So there's a diagram in there, and it's got like that describes the information environment, and it's got like 3 poofy clouds in there. And it's got like little arrows going back and forth between the cognitive dimension, the information dimension, and the physical dimension. And that's actually pretty good. But in the Jacobi, who the author criticized it and talked about it being that's a transmission model. And I can say from a communication scholar perspective, that was a misapplication of, transmission model has nothing to do with the poofy cloud diagram. I mean, my problem with the poofy cloud diagram is that it's one dimensional, or I guess 2-dimensional if it's on paper, kind of represent. There you go, right there.
We'll put a link to this in the show notes as well. This is figure I-1, the information environment, chapter 1, figure 1.
No, I think that's a valid way of looking at the information environment. However, I would put it on a 3-dimensional axis. I would think of it more, instead of poofy clouds, as a cube. and you have an X, Y, and Z axis, and each one of those X, Y, and Z axis represents the cognitive, the physical, and the informational. So like in a three-dimensional cube, even though, so if you visualize a three-dimensional cube, and if you're looking to affect like physical systems, you're going to move along the axis of the physical, you're going to move along the physical axis, but there will always be a cognitive and informational dimension to what you're doing in the physical dimension. So it'll be less, but but still. So if, for example, if you want to achieve effects against an adversary's physical SCADA system or something like that, you're moving out in the physical dimension, but there's still going to be a cognitive aspect to it, and there's still going to be an informational aspect to it. So it's just going to be less. And likewise, if you're moving out in the cognitive dimension in terms of trying to influence a target audience, you're still going to have to contend with the physical and informational components of that. So they all work in concert, but in different degrees depending upon what you do. So that would be my way of conceptualizing the information environment.
Okay, interesting stuff there. So you mentioned a book earlier by Kathleen Jameson. Are there any other books that you could recommend to our audience, which might touch upon some of these themes?
Yeah, I think one of the most switched on communication scholars that really gets it about the impact of information and communication technology is Manuel Castells, and his book Communication Power. And I would recommend that to anybody who's interested. Number one, what we're really talking about is less information but more communication, and communication from the standpoint of creating meaning, that we as human beings work with other human beings to create meaning about our world. I mean, we all have our own personal realities, but when we talk about at the societal level, we're working with other human beings to figure out what's going on. Now that's as opposed and so you have there's you can say like the prevalent powers, or be it corporate or government or adversaries, what have you, they're trying to affect the way that we create meaning. And the way that they try and affect that is through the communication process. So it's really important to understand that. And one of Castell's going in propositions in the book is that the shaping of minds is a more decisive and lasting form of domination than the submission of bodies by intimidation or violence. So it is through communication that power is exerted, and it's important to recognize that at the end of the day, how we create meaning is really what you're trying to get after in terms of operations in the information environment. So this is Communication Power. It's a great book. He also has another series of books called The Network Society. And so he talks about how the information communication technology, through the creation of networks, has fundamentally altered how we organize ourselves and exchange information. And that's also reflected in network-centric warfare. So in giving the Toffler thing about the way we make money is the way we make war, there you have it. So
yeah, all right. Yeah. Well, we will be sure that we have links in the show notes to a number of the Castells books. Fascinating stuff. And with that, Mr. Randy Rosin, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, it's been my pleasure, John. Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.